The zoo cameras were supposed to monitor visitors, but one night they captured something strange. A gorilla stood in the middle of the enclosure, staring directly into the camera as if it knew someone was watching, and what happened the next morning shocked everyone at the zoo, because the gorilla didn't just recognize the cameras, it was waiting for someone. At Ridgway Wildlife Park in Oregon, there lived a massive silverback gorilla named Koba. He weighed over 420 pounds and stood nearly 6 feet tall when he rose on his hind legs. Visitors were fascinated by him, often pressing their hands against the viewing glass just to get a better look. But while the guests admired him, the keepers respected him. Koba wasn't just powerful. He was unusually observant. While the younger gorillas wrestled, chased each other, or slept lazily in the sun, Koba often preferred to sit alone on a large rock near the viewing window. From there, he would quietly watch the people walking past the enclosure, not casually, not the way animals normally glance at movement, but carefully, almost thoughtfully. Some of the staff joked that Koba studied visitors the same way humans studied animals. But one of the senior caretakers, Mark Sullivan, who had worked with primates for nearly 18 years, started noticing something even stranger. Koba didn't just watch people in general. Sometimes it seemed like he was looking for someone specific. Mark had developed a routine with the gorilla troop. Every morning at exactly 8:45 a.m., before the zoo opened to visitors, he walked through the service tunnel carrying breakfast for the animals. The cart usually held bananas, leafy greens, sweet potatoes, and sometimes watermelon, Koba's favorite treat. The younger gorillas always rushed toward the feeding area the moment they heard the metal gate slide open. They would chatter loudly, eager to grab their share before the others. But Koba never rushed. Instead, every single morning he walked slowly toward the far corner of the enclosure, where an old oak tree stood. The branches cast long shadows across the ground, especially in the early morning light. Koba would stop there and wait, not for food, but for Mark to arrive at the gate. And each day, before touching any of the fruit or vegetables, Koba looked directly at Mark and tapped the ground 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. At first, Mark thought nothing of it. Animals repeat behaviors all the time. But after several weeks, he realized something unusual. Koba only did it when Mark appeared, not when other keepers came near the enclosure. Only Mark. It started to feel less like random movement and more like a signal, maybe even a greeting. Everything changed on a stormy Tuesday night. Heavy rain poured over Ridgway Wildlife Park, forcing most visitors to leave early and sending the majority of the staff home ahead of schedule. Only a few night keepers and security guards remained on site. Around 2:17 a.m., one of the motion cameras inside the gorilla enclosure suddenly activated. Normally that wouldn't have meant much. Animals move around at night, and the cameras recorded motion all the time. But when security reviewed the footage later, something about it made the entire room go silent. In the video, Koba slowly walked into the center of the enclosure. He looked upward, directly toward the security camera mounted above the habitat wall. Then he stood up completely upright. For almost 2 full minutes, the massive silverback didn't move. He simply stared into the lens as if he understood exactly what it was. No pacing, no scratching, no wandering, just watching. And then Koba did something that made the footage even more unsettling. He lowered one arm and tapped the ground 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Exactly the same pattern he used every morning when Mark arrived. The next morning, Mark followed his routine just like always. At 8:45 a.m., he pushed the food cart down the service corridor expecting to hear the usual chaos of hungry gorillas waiting for breakfast. But the moment he stepped inside the tunnel, he felt that something was wrong. The enclosure was quiet, far too quiet. Instead of running around or calling to each other, the gorillas sat still, watching, and Koba was already standing near the feeding gate, waiting. That had never happened before. Mark unlocked the feeding hatch and slid the tray forward. Koba stepped closer, his massive hands resting against the bars. He looked directly at Mark's face, and then tapped the ground 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, he didn't walk away afterward. Instead, he slowly reached one arm through the feeding bars and placed something onto the concrete floor between them. Mark frowned and crouched down to look. Gorillas didn't normally bring objects to keepers. They didn't collect items and hand them over like that. Curious, Mark picked up the small muddy object lying on the ground. The moment he turned it over, a cold feeling ran through his stomach. It was a visitor wristband from the zoo. Bright plastic, the kind guests received at the entrance gate. But that made no sense. The zoo had closed the previous evening, and visitors were never allowed anywhere near the gorilla enclosure after hours. Mark slowly looked back up at Koba. The giant silverback was watching him closely, his dark eyes focused and intense. There was something unusual about the way he stood there, almost urgent, like he was trying to communicate something important. Then Koba turned away and began walking toward the old oak tree in the corner of the habitat. When he reached it, he stopped. He looked back at Mark and pointed at the ground. Mark's heart began to pound as a memory suddenly resurfaced in his mind. Earlier that morning, there had been a brief message from the security office during the staff check-in meeting. At the time, it had seemed like a minor issue. One of the night guards hadn't reported for his shift change. Everyone assumed he had simply gone home early because of the storm, but standing there now, holding a muddy visitor wristband that shouldn't have been inside the enclosure, Mark felt a deep sense of unease creeping into his chest. He slowly glanced back toward Koba. The silverback was still pointing at the ground beneath the oak tree. Later that day, when the zoo staff checked the security footage again, they discovered something that turned the entire situation into a nightmare. The missing night guard had somehow entered the gorilla enclosure in the middle of the storm. And Koba was the only one who saw what happened. Mark stood there for several seconds, staring at the muddy visitor wristband in his hand, while the massive silverback watched him from the corner of the enclosure. The other gorillas remained strangely quiet, almost as if they understood that something unusual was happening. Koba slowly walked back to the oak tree and again pointed at the ground beneath it. Not aggressively, not like a threat, but deliberately, calm, intentional. Mark had worked with primates long enough to recognize when an animal was trying to communicate something. This felt different from normal behavior. It felt purposeful. Mark stepped back from the feeding gate and immediately called the security office. Within 15 minutes, the zoo's morning supervisor and 2 security officers arrived near the enclosure. They asked Mark to explain everything again. The wristband, Koba's behavior, the pointing near the tree. At first, the guards seemed skeptical. Animals sometimes pick up objects that visitors drop near barriers. Maybe the storm had blown something inside the enclosure. But Mark shook his head. The visitor paths were far from the habitat fence, and there was no way a plastic wristband could have ended up in the middle of the gorilla enclosure on its own. Then Mark showed them the footage from the night camera. The room fell silent. On the screen, the video showed Koba walking into the center of the enclosure at 2:17 a.m., staring directly into the security camera. Then the tapping, 3 slow taps on the ground. The exact same pattern Mark had seen every morning for months. One of the guards leaned closer to the monitor. "Wait," he said quietly. "Rewind a few seconds." They watched the footage again. This time they noticed something they had missed before. Right before Koba stepped into the center of the enclosure, the camera captured movement near the habitat gate, a shadow passing quickly across the frame. The storm had made the image grainy, and the rain blurred much of the detail, but the shape was unmistakably human. Someone had been inside the enclosure. The supervisor immediately called the head of zoo security. Within half an hour, the area around the gorilla habitat was sealed off. Visitors weren't allowed near that part of the park, and several staff members gathered near the service tunnel entrance. Everyone had the same question: how could a person have entered the enclosure at night and not triggered alarms? And more importantly, where was the missing guard? Mark walked back to the feeding gate, his eyes fixed on Koba. The silverback was still near the oak tree. When he saw Mark return, he slowly stepped aside and again pointed toward the ground. The message was impossible to ignore. Mark turned to the security team. "I think he wants us to look there." Normally, entering a gorilla enclosure while the animals were inside would be unthinkably dangerous. A silverback like Koba could easily overpower several humans. But something about the situation felt different. Koba wasn't showing aggression. In fact, he had moved the rest of the gorillas toward the opposite side of the habitat, almost like he was giving the humans space. The zoo's veterinary staff prepared a mild food distraction for the troop. Baskets of fruit were placed on the far end of the enclosure to keep the younger gorillas busy, while the staff carefully approached the oak tree area from the service gate. As soon as the keepers stepped inside, Koba slowly backed away. He didn't charge, he didn't threaten, he simply watched. Mark walked cautiously toward the oak tree. The soil beneath it looked darker than the surrounding ground, wet from the night's rain. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but when one of the guards knelt down and brushed away some loose dirt, he froze. "Guys, you need to see this." Half buried in the mud was something metallic, a flashlight. Not a zoo-issued one, a heavy-duty security flashlight, the exact type carried by night guards. Mark's chest tightened. The guard carefully pulled the flashlight from the mud. The handle was scratched, and the lens was cracked, as if it had been dropped or struck against something hard. But that wasn't the worst part. When they moved more dirt away from the base of the tree, they found something else. A deep impression in the wet soil, the unmistakable outline of a human boot, and right next to it, another print, much larger, a gorilla footprint. The team exchanged nervous glances. It looked as if someone had been standing near the tree during the storm, and Koba had been there too. But the missing guard was still nowhere to be found. Zoo security quickly expanded the search area. Staff checked the surrounding paths, service roads, and maintenance buildings. Drones were launched to scan the nearby forest that bordered the park. Nothing. No sign of the guard. No sign of anyone leaving the property. Meanwhile, Mark couldn't take his eyes off Koba. The silverback had climbed halfway up the oak tree and was watching everything from above. His expression was calm but focused, as if he were observing whether the humans understood the situation yet. Mark slowly approached the tree again, this time studying the ground more carefully. That's when he noticed something strange. The soil around the roots looked recently disturbed, not just from rain, but from digging. He crouched down and pressed his hand into the soft mud. It sank deeper than expected. "Hold on," Mark said quietly. One of the guards brought over a small shovel from the maintenance cart. They began digging slowly, removing layers of wet soil from around the base of the tree. A few inches down, the shovel hit something solid. The guard froze. Everyone around the tree went silent. Mark knelt down and used his hands to brush the dirt away. A piece of dark fabric appeared beneath the mud. Then a zipper. It was part of a jacket. Security uniforms at the zoo were dark blue. Mark's heart began pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. They cleared more soil away, and then the shape underneath became unmistakable. Someone had buried something there, and Koba had been trying to show them exactly where to look. Mark slowly looked up toward the branches of the oak tree. The silverback gorilla was staring down at them. Not angry, not aggressive, just watching, as if he had been waiting all morning for them to finally understand. But the moment the team uncovered more of the buried jacket, one of the guards suddenly shouted, "Stop digging!" Everyone froze. Because the fabric wasn't attached to a body. It had been ripped away, like it had been torn during a struggle, which meant only one thing. Whatever had happened here during the storm, the missing guard might still be alive somewhere inside the zoo. And Koba might be the only witness who knew the truth. The moment the torn security jacket appeared beneath the mud, the entire team around the oak tree went silent. The rain from the previous night had turned the soil into thick, heavy clay, and the fabric was soaked and partially buried among the roots. But it was unmistakable. Dark blue, security issue, the same uniform worn by the missing night guard. Mark's hands were still covered in mud as he slowly lifted the torn piece of fabric from the ground. The rip along the sleeve looked violent, as if it had been torn during a struggle. For a moment no one spoke. Everyone was thinking the same thing. If the jacket was here, where was the guard? One of the officers immediately radioed the search team to expand the sweep across the zoo grounds. The park covered dozens of acres, including service roads, wooded areas, and several unused maintenance buildings near the back perimeter. If someone had been injured or unconscious during the storm, they could have wandered far from the enclosure. But Mark couldn't stop looking at Koba. The silverback was still sitting high in the oak tree branches, watching everything below with quiet intensity. When Mark looked up at him, Koba slowly climbed down and returned to the ground. He approached the tree again, stopping a few feet from the disturbed soil. Then he did the same thing Mark had seen so many times before. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow knocks on the ground. But this time, instead of pointing at the dirt, Koba turned his head toward the outer fence line that bordered the forest behind the zoo. Mark followed his gaze. There was a narrow maintenance path there that led toward an old storage building used for equipment and backup generators. Normally it stayed locked, but during storms the maintenance crew sometimes checked the generators to ensure the power systems stayed stable. "Wait," Mark said quietly. He stood up and looked at the security team. "I think he's trying to show us something else." They all turned toward the direction Koba had been looking. At first it seemed unlikely. A gorilla couldn't possibly be guiding them somewhere. But then one of the guards remembered the camera footage from the night before. Koba staring directly into the security camera. The tapping signal, the wristband he had handed to Mark, and the spot under the tree where the jacket had been found. None of that was random. If Koba was reacting to something he saw during the night, there was a chance he was still trying to tell them what happened. The search team carefully moved along the maintenance path, with Mark following behind them. The enclosure fence ran parallel to the trail for about 50 yards before the path curved into the wooded edge of the property. Koba walked along inside the enclosure fence as they moved, keeping pace with the group. He stayed calm, occasionally glancing between the humans and the direction of the forest. After about a minute of walking, the lead guard suddenly raised his hand. "Stop." Everyone froze. There, in the wet gravel of the maintenance road, were faint footprints. Human footprints. The rain had washed most of the details away, but the shape was still visible. They led away from the enclosure, toward the storage building. The guard spoke quietly into his radio. "We've got tracks, heading toward the generator shed." The group continued forward, moving faster now. The storm clouds had begun clearing, and thin morning sunlight filtered through the trees as they approached the old building. The door was slightly open. One of the officers carefully pushed it wider. Inside, the room smelled of damp concrete and engine oil. For a moment they saw nothing. Then Mark heard something. A weak sound, like someone trying to speak. "Hello?" Mark called out. From behind a stack of equipment crates came a faint voice. "Over. Here." The guards rushed forward and found the missing night guard lying on the floor, pale and exhausted, but alive. His face was bruised, and one arm was wrapped awkwardly around his ribs. It looked like he had been there for hours. "Easy," one of the officers said, kneeling beside him. "What happened?" The guard struggled to sit up, breathing heavily. "There was someone in the enclosure," he said. Everyone in the room went still. "A trespasser," he continued. "I saw movement on the cameras during the storm. Thought it was just an animal near the fence. But when I went to check, someone had climbed inside." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean inside?" he asked. "The gorilla enclosure," the guard said weakly. "Guy must have jumped the outer barrier. Probably thought the storm meant no one would see him." "Why would anyone do that?" another officer asked. The guard shook his head. "I think he was trying to steal something. Maybe one of the young gorillas. Wildlife traffickers sometimes target zoos." The room fell silent again. "He had a bag," the guard continued. "Tranquilizer equipment. I tried to stop him, but when he saw me, he attacked. Knocked me down. I lost my flashlight. My jacket got torn in the struggle." Mark immediately thought of the spot beneath the oak tree. "What happened next?" he asked. The guard stared at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up slowly. The silverback happened. Outside, through the open door of the generator shed, they could see the gorilla enclosure in the distance. Koba was still standing near the fence, watching the building quietly. The guard swallowed. "That gorilla came out of nowhere. I thought I was dead." The guy ran toward the trees, but the gorilla charged him. Not like an animal attacking, more like he was driving him away. "Did he hurt him?" one of the officers asked. "I don't know," the guard said. The guy dropped his bag and ran toward the forest. "I tried to follow, but I was already hurt. I barely made it here before I collapsed." Within minutes, paramedics arrived to take the injured guard to the hospital. Security teams began scanning the forest beyond the zoo for the intruder. But Mark stayed behind for a moment, looking out toward the enclosure. Koba was still there, standing quietly near the fence. Watching, Mark slowly walked back along the maintenance path until he reached the enclosure again. The silverback approached from the other side of the barrier, his massive figure moving calmly through the grass. For a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other. Mark placed his hand against the metal fence. "You knew something was wrong," he said softly. Koba tilted his head slightly. Then he lowered his hand to the ground. Tap, tap, tap. The same signal he had used every morning. But this time Mark understood it differently. It wasn't just a greeting. It was the way Koba tried to get someone's attention when something important happened. The way he had tried to alert them during the night. The way he had shown them the wristband, the tree, the path. If Koba hadn't done that, the missing guard might never have been found, and the intruder might have escaped without anyone knowing what really happened inside the enclosure that stormy night. Later that week, the story spread across the zoo staff, and eventually through local news. A silverback gorilla had protected his territory, but more importantly, he had tried to warn the humans. From that day on, Mark never ignored the 3 taps again, because sometimes the smartest witness in the zoo was the one living behind the glass.